Hello, everybody, and welcome to A Soulful Revolution, a podcast at the intersection of spiritual transformation and social change. I'm your host, Lauren Grubaugh-Thomas, a priest, writer, spouse, and twin mama living in Colorado on Arapaho and Cheyenne homelands. Every episode, I feature a conversation with a soulful revolutionary, someone whose commitment to justice is nourished by their spiritual beliefs, values, and practices, and whose approach to spirituality is clarified by their courageous engagement in the world. My guest today is Maki Ashe Van Steenwyk, a writer, activist, and queer mystic whose work explores the intersections of spirituality, power, and transformation. She's the founder and executive director of the Center for Prophetic Imagination, where she develops frameworks for integrating spiritual practice with radical social action. So we are sister institutions in terms of the kind of work that we're doing, and very much curious to hear from you today about who you are and the work that you do. So it is just a delight to have you at A Soulful Revolution. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me.
I want to begin by asking you the question I pose to all of my guests, which is, what does it mean to you to live at the crossroads of spiritual transformation and social change?
Yeah, I mean, I've done classes on that kind of question, and it's hard to narrow it down. But to me, I think it starts with recognizing that in my community and in my body, there's not really a disconnect between spirituality and social change. And that's part of the thing that I think we're kind of lied to about, probably not intentionally. And so we think of them as separate buckets. And we think that in order to fill up the action bucket, we have to draw from the spirituality bucket. And then we go off and pray and refill the spirituality bucket. It's that kind of, for me, living at the intersection just means, among other things, realizing that there's a spiritual way to engage the world that's active, and that my spirituality, no matter how disconnected it seems to be, is still political. Yeah, I know that's really abstract. I think at a personal level, it means just kind of noticing the disconnects around me, like the gaps between people, the quiet parts that people aren't saying out loud, all those little hidden things. To me, that sort of attentiveness required for that is both spiritual and kind of the source of radical politics.
Mm-hmm. I'm really curious to hear how that attentiveness to the gaps, that awareness of the way the world is and the way it could be, how you first remember beginning to come into that sense, that consciousness. What were some of the ways that you were raised, or that you were formed, that your identity has formed how you inhabit that sense of presence?
I think there's always been a part of me that is discontent and just feels like something's off. Part of that is tied up in my trans experience. But besides that, the churches around me often, focused on contentment and gratitude, and that's those things are good. I'm not going to say gratitude is bad, but
Sure.
when it's used to cover up that sort of disquiet in our souls, it can get in the way and be a problematic thing. And so for me, I think growing up the way I did, there was always this sense of unease about this doesn't seem like how it's supposed to work. The American dream, as it was pitched to me, or I absorbed it, it seemed like not accurate for what was happening. And the things that I heard in church that really inspired me, the things I read about in the Bible, particularly the Gospels, when I then look at the churches around me and see that disconnect, I wanted to go deeper into those disconnects. And I found resistance. And to me, my spirituality has been about leaning into those moments of disconnect and pain and kind of saying, what's going on here? And how can I experience the spirit in those places? I think that's kind of the heart of my own sense of spirituality, kind of pulling back the layers and not allowing myself to just kind of disconnect from these problems and then just plug into all the social myths that numb my mind. So I think I've always been predisposed to that, partly because of the trans thing, which we can get into in a bit if we want. But then kind of continuing that, even if the consequences of scratching and pulling the layers away are hard to deal with, I have this almost pathological need to kind of peel back and see what's going on there. And as I've done that, my spirituality has shifted and deepened. And sometimes in wonderful ways and other times in very painful ways.
I wonder if you'd share a little bit about the communities that have formed you or that were sites of tension in terms of that sense that you had to peel back the layers.
Yeah, I grew up in rural Minnesota, and I wasn't really a part of a church-going family. And I really first started getting into Christianity or spirituality in my teens at a fundamentalist Bible camp. And I went to a charismatic church. And in both of those spaces, there were these things that they'd say, like especially in the charismatic spaces, that, if you are saved and are filled with the Holy Spirit, those kinds of constructs, then you're going to have power to do all these kinds of things. Like casting out demons, healing the sick, whatever. But then also, like, you'll go deeper and deeper, and church is like a family, and we love each other. All those sorts of things that were put out, and I'd look and see, like, that doesn't seem really like what's happening. It's happening in little bits, but people don't want to say the truth, right? There's a way in which churches tend to be so aspirational that they gloss over their failure. And to me, I could have gotten cynical about it and said, well, churches are bad and screw this. I'm going to do better or something like that, which I've had those moments. I mean, I've planted churches before. That was kind of where some of that came from. But part of it was this question of, if when I raised these questions, bad things would happen. I've had deliverance sessions done on me, casting out the spirit of rebellion and things. That happened. I was also castigated and rebuked a lot. And it came to this point where, and this happens a lot in conservative sorts of religious spaces, but it also happens everywhere else too. There can be a tendency to say, well, no, this is all, what we're saying is perfectly true. If there's a problem here, it's you. And so this is where categories like sin and, struggling against your body of death, like all this sort of mortification of the flesh kinds of ways of, I think we're taught those things in partly because of earnestness, but I also think structurally it ends up making you feel like the problem is you and you're not doing it right or good enough.
Yeah, it's like a systemic gaslighting.
Yeah, and to me there comes this point where if we are curious and honest, not only with the people around us and the systems around us, but with ourselves, we have these moments, or I've had these moments where I thought, well, I'm going to trust my intuition and my perspective on things more than what people are telling me, which is a really difficult spot to be in. And to start kind of, going with what I'm experiencing. Because if for me, it started like in these charismatic churches that I grew up in, there was a lot of talk about experiencing like a personal relationship with Jesus that looked a certain way, feeling the presence of the Spirit that looked a certain way. And if I didn't feel those things, I had a couple choices. One, to think it's just my problem because I'm not saved enough or I'm not doing it right.
Yeah.
Two, I can just walk away from it. Or three, I could say, well, maybe there's some truth here, but the way you're telling me about it or what you're embodying is, a little co-opted and a little murky. And so maybe I can kind of go deeper into this and see how it might really work in my life. There's all sorts of problems with trying to go out on your own to perceive things that way. Like I don't want to be an individualist who cuts myself off from community. But there was this crisis of faith. Do I really believe the Spirit is present? And if so, I should either do something about it or accept that I'm the problem here. And I saw so much oppression and shaming and sometimes violence in those spaces that I thought, well, I already know what happens if I can try to conform to that. So I'm not going to conform, and I'm going to see what happens. And I'm going to surround myself with people who feel similar agitation. Not because I reject everything that the charismatic church taught me, but because in some ways I take it more seriously. That if we encounter Spirit or the Spirit in our lives, it'll bear fruit. And if I'm not seeing the fruit, maybe I need to tend elsewhere. And I feel like I've done that in a number of times in my life, and it doesn't usually go well for like stability and legitimacy.
Sure.
But to me, it's kind of at the heart of the spiritual life. Some measure of that.
Yeah. No, I hear the theme of agitation and of destabilizing assumptions and institutions that are trying to hold on to control. And I am curious to hear the ways in which your trans identity, as you were beginning to articulate that along the way, how that was part of this experience of destabilizing within these institutions, of questioning these institutions that you were part of, and of, how that experience of emergent identity was, well, I'm curious how you would describe it, but how that shaped and was interwoven with this experience in terms of your spiritual journey.
Yeah, I think for a lot of years, for most of my life, I didn't think I was queer because we have these social scripts that we come up in that we don't choose for ourselves. We're not sitting around. Children don't sit around thinking, "What do I think about American exceptionalism?" They just grow up around it, and it forms them.
Yeah.
And so I had all these assumptions about myself, and I couldn't even come out to myself until enough of those assumptions were punctured. Right? Which was really difficult and embarrassing in some ways for me because I was 45, but when I realized, and before that I'd hung out with all kinds of queer people. I always thought of myself as such a great ally because I just somehow, for some reasons that I couldn't quite figure out, felt way more comfortable around queer people. And I assumed because the script that I had still told me, I had a sense of who I was that was not a trans woman, I thought, well, I must be a really good cis man then. Until I realized that didn't make it sense. And so there was this leap of faith. And, this is not the normative trans experience. There isn't a normative trans experience. Every trans journey is different. But when I came out, I wasn't entirely sure until I came out, which is weird. It's I could get all really nerdy here about speech act theory and the nature of ritual and stuff, but I had to say I'm a trans, I'm queer, before that script that had such a hold over in my imagination cracked.
Wow.
And faith is a lot like that, and spirituality is a lot like that. There has to be these little leaps.
Yeah.
And those sorts of leaps aren't difficult because they're irrational and we have to just trust God and jump off the cliff. That's how usually we, hear stories about what faith is. For me, it was more about, who am I going to listen to here? the social script that's been reinforced by a lifetime of experience that felt off, but it's because I'm a sinner, and that's just the way it goes. You always feel like things always feel wrong because we're sinners. Like, do I believe
It
that?
teaches you, right, not to trust your intuition, not to trust your judgment.
Not to trust our bodies.
Yeah.
Not to trust fringe people. Not to trust those queer folks because they're unstable somehow. Like, oh, don't trust. And we can have, I could have my ideological ducks in a row and not really believe that anymore. But that doesn't mean it's permeated into my soul. So that was this crisis of faith and like kind of moment where maybe I'm not really the problem here the way I think that I am. And maybe if I listen to all these instincts and intuitions and things I've heard from people I love that I thought, that's weird, and I just pushed it aside. What if I listen to all that instead of these assumptions that are hard baked into my psyche so much that I didn't even know they were my assumptions? Right? So there's a term in kind of psychology and social psychology, anti-process.
That's new to me. I've not heard of that.
We all experience, most of us are familiar with the idea of cognitive dissonance, this idea that our experience doesn't match what we think about something. And so we have this little internal quiver, like to either double down or to be open to the possibility we're wrong. Anti-process is a layer deeper than that, where we can't even raise the question. We can't even look directly at it. And it's why sometimes people that are, like if you have an Uncle Gary is a big racist, but he doesn't seem defensive about it. And he seems like otherwise a rational guy. And you talk to him about it, and it's not like he even gets adversarial. Like, it's just he can't even open himself up to the possibility that society is as racist as it is. Like that sort of inability to even experience the cognitive dissonance.
Wow. This has me thinking
Anti-process.
about like Elon Musk talking about how we live in a simulation, and like that the whole like stream of thought among white straight men who are raised to imagine that their world is that their reality is the only reality, that the reality in which they live in is truth, capital T. And I've just found myself so bewildered by it because I, as someone who's socialized as a woman, I've always had this experience of like there being at least two realities. And then getting older and realizing, and I exist as a person who's racialized as a white person, and that is that is not the only reality, that there's so many other realities that's such helpful language and it feels like societally that's a lot of what we're experiencing right now is some of us who are like, no, there's lots of different experiences happening here of this US reality, and then other people who are like, no, it's just this way, it's just one way, and you all need to just get on board.
Yeah, and it gets difficult having conversations with, there's all sorts of stereotypes about conservatives or even like of the more fascistic sort, that they're just dumb. Like, that's not, I get why people like to go there, sure, but it's ridiculous. It's because it's not about,
it's too easy.
It's not about intelligence or conceptual capacity. It's deeper than that. In the realms of desire and like trust and where we feel safe, like those sorts of almost the soft animal of our flesh kind of things, right? It gets even hardwired into our brains, like disgust mechanisms. There's been all these studies, and I don't want to go too deep into this, but when you're walking down the street and you are avoidant of a stereotypically homeless looking person, you don't have to decide to dehumanize them.
Yeah.
You can be wired. Your medial prefrontal cortex can be wired on disgust input so that you have an instinctive disgust response to certain people. That's precognitive. You don't think about it. So we think like so much of our lives, we walk around doing things. We think we have meaningful choices and actions, and meaningful choices and actions are rare. We just think that we're making choices because we think, well, I chose this sandwich instead of that one. Well, that's not a meaningful choice. Yeah, I don't want to get too bogged down in that, but like that sort of reality, the complexity of what it means to be a person in community, a self, and how our self is shaped. All those things are way more messy than we like to think. So we have these stories we tell ourselves to make it all simpler, and they are safe. Even they're safe feeling like they're because you can reach out and they seem sturdy, even if they're not benefiting you. It's
Right.
hard to let go of them.
Yeah.
And we have this idea that, well, I have to then work through like what the alternative is, kind of like building a new house before you move. But the reality of the spiritual life, or at least the self-reflective life that's oriented towards justice anyways, requires like leaving these structures, these houses, without having a new house. We have to kind of build it as we go
Yeah.
along. And that's not nearly as comfortable
No.
as living in the house America built, you know?
Oh, there's so many quotes that jump to mind as you're saying that. Audre Lorde talking about the master's house will not be dismantled with the master's tools. And Antonio Machado, one of my favorite poets, has the line that folks always quote about, "We make the path by walking it." That like, wayfarer, there is no way. We make the way by walking it. Um, and I'm really curious, like in our American context, about how we practice those muscles, how we find those muscles in the first place, for those for whom they've really atrophied, because we're not socialized to take those leaps of faith, to take those risks, to step out. And so I'm curious, within your work with the Center for Prophetic Imagination, how you see that as the formation of people. Like, what are the ways in which you hope that people might be nurtured, might be empowered to be able to take that first step into the unknown?
I don't really know the answer to that, in like at least in a satisfying way. How we go about doing it, because it's obvious to me that just presenting counter information doesn't do nearly as much as we like to think. Churches tend to be sermon centered. Not all of them, but a lot of them are, and there's this assumption that thoughts shape action,
Mm,
and it's like kind of this one-way street, and that's not at all how it really works. Not that information like that is irrelevant. So to even be able to get into that space, there has to be a certain amount of vulnerability between people, and vulnerability is scary and difficult. Vulnerability is, kind of the source of precarity and suffering. You're exposed, and people that want to do violence or harm or exploit you can do that if you're in a vulnerable spot. But at the same time, you can't experience love or community, or social movements for justice without some level of vulnerability. So, when we've taught spiritual directors in our program, which we've put on pause for a while, it's really about, a spiritual director sits with people and creates this safe space where it becomes easier for them to kind of pull on threads, or as a spiritual director to say what you're noticing. And if there's enough vulnerability there, then it creates enough of a container for curiosity to start pulling. And things start unraveling, if you do that long enough. In kind of short term, like in spaces where you don't have much vulnerability, seeing that kind of transformation is rare. But sometimes little the spirit blows where the spirit will, right? So things happen where people experience something that forces them to really look at the cognitive dissonance there that they have. And that usually comes from, I think really helpful social movements often have this sort of exposing the narrative kind of quality. It's not just a power grab so we can create structures our way. It's also trying to figure out with our bodies, with our engagement with the world, with our creative output, how to expose the nature of things enough for people to have a little bit more of an opportunity to question their narratives and themselves in some ways, but then also to trust themselves in other ways.
Yeah.
Right. So in spiritual direction, it's not just about pointing out how I've noticed you keep saying this thing that about yourself, you're putting yourself down a lot. Right. You could, in that moment, I can focus on that thing, and then they'll say, well, I should stop doing that. Right. Or you could say, you keep saying this, what, if I think about what the opposite of that is that you're amazing. Why aren't you willing to accept you're amazing? And that's a way of reframing it that kind of raises the cognitive dissonance, right?
Higher stakes.
Yeah, higher stakes. And if we don't have a vulnerable relationship with people, it's hard to do that. But there are these traditions of holy foolishness and sort of absurd engagements with people that cause enough disruption. People acting in ways that they don't expect can disrupt things. That's why, people who are extremely anti-trans, once they meet someone who's trans that they kind of like in some kind of way as a coworker or a family member, that starts kind of grating at that cognitive dissonance. So there's all these little things, bopping around. So I think often the best we can do is try to draw attention to that and create space for people to look at it and realize that's often the most we can do.
When you were talking about the systems that we live in and helping people understand the reality, you use the word expose, which just struck me in thinking about vulnerability and exposure, the nakedness that we can feel as individuals when we're in a conversation with somebody where we're bearing our souls. But thinking about systems, I've never thought of that word exposure in terms of vulnerability, but that's such an interesting way to frame the ways in which effectively the emperor can be shown to have no clothes. If we can see the vulnerability of systems, then perhaps that's another way into that vulnerability that that we need to be able to enact change. And I wonder, you use the word absurdity too. We're living in such an absurd political moment. There's just the volume of actions that are being taken that are so incredibly egregious, and there's no attempt being made to be politically correct or to be palatable. They're the right wing and the fascists among us are just having a field day of doing the very most. And so I'm curious, your perspective in terms of the ways that as spiritually rooted people contending for a world of justice, a world where people can be existing in these precarious, vulnerable relationships that are inherent to being human, and feel some safety in doing that. What does it look like to expose these systems for what they are, and what are maybe some of the strategies rooted in spiritual practice? You've alluded to some of them, and I'm just curious, sort of moving from that interpersonal dynamic to the systemic. What might be helpful?
I'm going to try not to get lost in the weeds because I'm in the middle of writing a dissertation.
Oh, wow.
That touches on some of these kinds of things, and I can kind of really go into some nerdy terrain that wouldn't really be helpful for for people.
I mean, I'm here for it, but like, yeah, choose your lane if you'd like.
So, I think a few things, just if I can kind of pluck them out of my dissertation and highlight them a little bit. One, I think it's important to recognize that power isn't just something that's outside of us pushing down. Most people who experience oppression aren't doing it at gunpoint. Most of the oppression people experience, they maintain themselves, right? Because power is, to get a little bit into Michel Foucault, I guess, power is a script, really. It's language, it's narrative, and things like that. And so, that's why it's tempting just to say, like, well, no, we should do socialism instead. That's not language in that way. It's just all these assumptions and myths that we don't even know how to articulate because they've been normalized. So part of the exposure is finding a way for people to realize that these different scripts aren't natural.
Right.
Right? So just to kind of go from there, and I'm going to make it more concrete in a second. Another piece of it is we also tend to think of power as a sort of regime. Mm-hmm. Like, these people have the power. We need to go get it from them and have it for what we want. But to me, these systems of oppression and systems of power, like, we can't really escape them because they're it's not just material culture, it's immaterial. It's the stories, it's the relationships. So it really is about, how do I change my relationship with these things? And then how do we as collectives of people, families, churches, organizations, cities, whatever, change our relationship with those things? Right? And then the next step is, how do we, as we change the relationship, how can we in those relationships expose the nature of them, but then also that we don't have to do it that way? So a good classic example is segregation was justified under this lie of separate but equal. If you weren't a white person in the civil rights era in particular, but still to today, that the separate wasn't equal. There was the good version of things and the shittier versions of things. And the shittier versions of things was for the black people, right? And that lie exposed, that lie covered over that reality. And it also covered over this idea that, hey, I don't have anything wrong. I have nothing against black people. My problem is, like, we need to have our white spaces. So when they sat at lunch counters, black civil rights activists and white allies sat down, it raised this anger, like, you're violating the rules. So anything we do to you is fair game because you're a lawbreaker. And so what that began to expose for everyone watching is, wow, these people are starting to be treated in a dehumanizing way. Some people were so caught up in the social script that they thought, it's like, in the Black Lives Matters protests, almost everyone that was of any size in a major city, someone with a car would start driving into the group. And I'd hear people say, like, what do you expect? You're blocking the road. Which is a ridiculous statement.
It is. As if that's the determining factor for why someone should bulldoze a group of people.
Yeah, it's irrational to think that. There's contradictory views there. The value of human life with that, and so it kind of starts that provocation, that kind of the naked rage of supremacists becomes this opportunity of revelation for people who aren't as committed to that narrative. So pretty soon like within a decade, people started thinking, that they were with Martin Luther King Jr. from the beginning when they were not. Right? They rewrote the script.
He was the most hated man in America, and yet the way that he's lionized, which is problematic in its own way in terms of making one person a hero and forgetting that it was a whole strategic effort. But the whole shift in narrative is super interesting around the civil rights movement.
Yeah, and there's smaller way, like that's obviously this big historic example, but there's all sorts of ways, like within the tradition of the Holy Fool, just acting out in ways that kind of like are upsetting to people, but having those absurdities kind of wrapped up in kind of violating norms that don't serve, that are not beneficial, right? I'm trying to think of some concrete examples, not just the ones from the like Middle Ages and stuff. But I feel like this isn't exactly an example of holy foolishness, but homeless encampments that have become consolidated in one place raises the question, right? So when a lot of people are so caught up in the idea that if there's people experiencing homelessness, all living in a tent city, and the police bulldoze it and take their stuff, they have it coming. But also that sort of raising the visibility of people experiencing homelessness and and revealing the narrative that of like the police are coming and taking what little they have and destroying it and making them increasingly closer to death, right? So a lot more people, and it's not nearly enough, care more about homelessness in a practical way than before those tent cities became a thing.
Right. Before that was a disruption to the narrative that, there's only a few people perhaps in our city. Like when people see en masse.
Because they were hidden before.
Yes, hidden away.
That's why cities hate these encampments, is because, there are some like structural problems that happen that are unpleasant, right? With trash and things like, there's all that sort of stuff. But also the reason that it's hated is because it just raises the question in a way that can't be avoided. With Black Lives Matter and the shutting down of interstates, people used to scream all the time when we were on the interstate blocking things because it didn't seem to have anything to do with what we were talking about. And it didn't. But it forced discomfort, and people couldn't ignore it. Like the newspapers writing articles about Interstate 94 getting shut down, and people can't avoid it anymore. So there's, in a way, the interstate shutdown stuff kind of functioned as an act of holy foolishness. It broke a social norm.
I love
in a way
that framing
forced
of it. Yeah. And creating discomfort for people in their ordinary routine, which brings up what you were talking about at the very beginning of our conversation around the ways in which spiritual communities, faith communities can be really geared toward comfort. And so I'm curious about, with the Center for Prophetic Imagination, and just the ways that you build community in general, like what does it look like to build communities that have this practice of disrupting cheap comfort look like?
This is where it starts intersecting with kind of liberationist kinds of spirituality.
Sure.
The idea of centering marginalized people in our different movement spaces or in church spaces that's not a call to altruism and empathy. Not primarily. I mean, empathy and altruism altruism is a complicated concept, but we don't need more people to try to be good guys, to do the right thing as a motive in and of itself. That's a weird motive. It's like, I want to know what the right things are so I can study for the test of life. Like, that's not how it is.
Right.
It's because the perception of people who have experienced marginalization and oppression, they see things differently. They are more aware generally of the downsides. So when we center marginalized perspectives in our communities. It's this invitation for those of us who have more ease and comfort and privilege, prosperity, whatever, to start feeling uncomfortable a lot more. And we should encourage that, right? It's the Holy Spirit's a comforter. Jesus says the Holy Spirit's a comforter. If for those who are listening in the Christian tradition, that's true. But the comfort is a subversive comfort.
Mm-hmm.
It's not. The Holy Spirit isn't comforting Elon Musk right now. Like, I know that's a bold claim that I can know, right? Receiving comfort for someone who is living in a place of precarity is subversive to the system. So I think that discomfort only becomes tolerable for people if they start to really believe that the ways that they're experiencing comfort now, the way I experience comfort as a white person, if I settle in that, there's things that I miss out on that are better. I won't experience the liberation that I long for in my life if I hide behind the comfort of whiteness.
Yeah.
Right? Someone has to really believe that as a white person to start being a part of dismantling white supremacy. If they don't, if they're doing it out of, I want to score well on the quiz of life, people like that who are performatively leftist or liberal or progressive, whatever framework on it, anytime as soon as it gets too costly to be like that, they'll just go back to team white supremacy, and we're seeing that right now.
Yeah. Say more about that.
Trump, in a way, Trump is kind of like this nefarious, he's like the shadow universe version of a holy fool, because he says all the quiet parts out loud, and it's transgressive, and then what it does is allows people who have fascistic instincts and impulses to feel like, oh, I don't have to feel uncomfortable with that. I'm going to start saying the hard R now when I'm talking, about black people. Like they're emboldened and it feels cathartic to not have to try so hard anymore. It's like their load is lightened. Mm-hmm. And it's that feeling can feel similar to liberation, but it's not. So there's this sort of interesting kind of dynamic that's happening now where there are some truths being revealed, but it's not in a liberatory way. It's just people are realizing, oh, America's always been kind of like this. Good. Let's be fascist now. Like there's people that are kind of like, let's just double down on it. They're choosing that side of relieving the pressure of cognitive dissonance.
Yeah, that's such a helpful framing, Ash, to think about it as the shadow side of liberation, like that there is a comfort people are receiving in responding with ignorance, responding with hatred, responding with fear and with anger, because they feel emboldened. It's the shame has been taken out of the room in terms of being able to speak freely with all this vitriol and hate. Yeah. But the comfort makes sense. Like the desire, the latching on to someone who tells you, no, like you're actually justified in feeling that way you feel.
And it gets really complicated because, I think this is an overstated thing, like this idea of there being a crisis of masculinity, like male loneliness and all these sorts of things. I don't want to unpack that as a social myth too much right now. It's not entirely false, but it's not exactly true either. So I'm going to bracket that. But this sort of script that, if you're a white dude who means well and he wants to be kind and tries so hard and then, still can't get a date, because women won't give them the time of day on Hinge or Tinder, and like it's hard to. I have to work so hard, and so I can't have friends, and my friendships aren't that deep, and like so I'm struggling. All of a sudden, this offer of like kind of fascism, it seems to scratch a lot of the itches of what's wrong.
Yeah.
Like, you're not the problem.
Yeah.
The problem is these immigrants and these trans perverts and all these sorts of things.
Mm.
And so the load lightens off of them, and so they feel emboldened. But if you look underneath that, look at it more positively, they're longing for the same thing everyone's longing for: community, freedom from shame, being a part of something important that's bigger than them, that helps make the world a better place. They just bought the lies. And so on kind of the other side of the spectrum of people who are longing for collective liberation from systems of oppression, and we're willing to name it as white supremacy and consumer capitalism, all these sorts of things. This is part of the reason why we're in such a political mess, is people left of center across that whole spectrum have been more about information and statistics and kind of a technocrat kind of ways of doing things, and not been telling much of a story about what the good life could be that includes them.
Yeah.
It's just, it's a sort of gospel of self-annihilation. Step back, close your mouth, and, you should care about, queer people and women and people of color because it's the right thing to do. But that's not enough of a message for anybody.
Yeah. That doesn't inspire people in the midst of the chaos to take risk or make themselves vulnerable.
But it's not that we just need to reach across the aisle and hold hands and try to get along either. The reality is, how do we cultivate a captivating vision of life free from oppression and make it compelling? And we know what that feels like in small spaces. Like when I host backyard karaoke, and we encourage encourage people to engage in gender play in a sensitive way and sing songs throughout the vocal spectrum, but not in a joking way, but just to kind of. And then we have a bonfire and talk and share our thoughts and dreams. That's a little glimpse of what liberation looks like. And we live
beautiful.
And people who do those sorts of things and have have mutual aid, and are friends with people who are working towards collective liberation and can be vulnerable with each other. That there's such a depth to that most white men in our society don't experience, or at least not in a deep enough way. And so the question is, how can everyone experience things like that, like all the time? Like that's kind of the goal.
Yeah, that's such a generous question.
Yeah, not that I'm saying I don't feel too bad for white men in society.
Sure.
I don't want to make it clear that I'm not. I'm not going to uplift. It's the number of white liberals who share the story of that black man who befriended a Klansman. Makes me feel uncomfortable sometimes. I'm not talking about that sort of a thing. I'm talking about it more of a transgressive liberation than that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it gives me a lot of hope to think about the ways in which invulnerability, or in a space of vulnerability, not invulnerability, but the ways in which folks can be invited to see reality as it really is, but also to be able to envision like a different kind of future, to imagine community, to imagine a place where we make meaning together, where we take care of each other, where there's mutual aid for the actual needs that we have. That's a really beautiful vision. And the karaoke is such a beautiful like microcosm of that. That's profound.
Do you do karaoke ever? Are you a karaoke
Once in a blue
person?
moon. I love to sing. What is your song? What's your go-to song?
Oh, if I were to pull out my phone and open up my Google Note that has the songs I do, there's like hundreds of songs on there.
That's
So
amazing.
so right now I have a handful that I do as my warm up song, but
Yeah.
lately it's either been something from Radiohead, like Creep,
Okay. Oh,
or
fun.
Landslide by Fleetwood Mac.
That is one of my very favorite songs of all time. So good.
I do pretty
Stevie
good at
Nicks
that one.
is an icon. Yeah. Oh, that's fantastic.
It's right in this range for me where I can, like, I'll go to, if I do it at a karaoke place I haven't been to before and they don't know who I am, like, and I go up and sing it, I can go through the whole thing and still pass as a conventional woman, and then I like messing with people a little bit, and then I'll do Audio Slaves like a Stone, or
Oh,
something
incredible.
or something from Joe Cocker,
Yeah.
or like something low and growly after that, and
How
just so I can
fun.
see people's reactions.
Yes. Yes. Creating spaces of disruption and
Yeah,
agitation. I love that. I
yeah,
love that. I wonder if there is a word of hope that you'd like to leave with our audience today.
yeah. I think it's hard to have hope in times like this, at least
Yeah.
for many of us. I think the word of hope that, like, at least I'm trying to cling on to is, like, look, thinking about the big picture, social transformation on the large scale, things like that. That's really outside of any of our capacity to do anything about at an individual level.
Yeah.
Um, and the sort of communities that are needed in order to sustain movements to really tackle that, we don't really have.
Hmm.
But what we do have is these opportunities to draw closer to people, and it's important to recognize that's where all transformation starts. Anyway,
Mm. Mm.
finding communities of, like, mutual aid,
Hmm.
where you have people who have your back and you have theirs, and you have trust and deepening friendship. All you need to add some discernment and some schemy energy to that, and
Yeah.
you start seeing that's where social movements come from. So in the meantime, the hope is to lean into that. We can Relationships like that are, it's really hard. There is a real pandemic of loneliness in general. But that doesn't have to be that way. There are people, no matter how isolated somebody feels, for the most part, there are people that have the same kinds of longings, concerns, and hopes as them. And if you take risks, sometimes you get to build community from that.
That's a beautiful seed to plant. And I thank you for sharing it. Thank you for your time today and for the vision that you've shared with us.
Thank you for having me.